This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. To misquote Oscar Wilde's Lady Bracknell, to lose one Choral Evensong may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. In fact, Radio 3 lost 4 in 5 weeks.
For the love of thy only Son, our Saviour, Jesus Christ.
Whoops, that was the first of many. In feedback this week, provided we don't drop off the air, we'll try and find out what keeps going wrong. Is it divine displeasure? And it's a hard life in Radio 4's presentation department.
Well, I must go now, as my duties aren't quite over yet. There's Mr. Donaldson's smoking jacket to air and press, and Miss Green's feather boa to hang up. Newsreaders are high maintenance. Indeed, the life of a continuity announcer is not all it seems.
Really? And the case of the mysterious voice. In last week's programme, we played you a clip of a commentator describing the Queen's coronation. The World at One said it was Richard Dimbleby. But they were mistaken. So, who is this?
The Dean of Westminster takes the orb, and the Archbishop places in the Queen's right hand the sceptre with the cross, the ensign of kingly power.
All will be revealed later, but I'll give you some clues. He wore a moustache. His middle names were Derek Mordaunt. And he was 22 when, in 1926, the BBC first broadcast Choral Evensong. 86 years later, and now on Radio 3, that programme can claim to be the longest-running outside broadcast anywhere in the world. Choral Evensong travels the kingdom from Truro to Edinburgh, and listener Susan Lester never misses an edition.
I love the programme. I have done for years and years and years. Unfortunately, I do tend to sing along to the hymns. Heaven knows what my neighbours think. And I do find it, a bit of a haven. The world is so mad at the moment. Everybody rushes around. But for an hour, sometimes twice a week, you can just think about the important things in life.
Susan is not the only one who sings along with the hymns. But recently, she has found herself frequently unaccompanied, as on several occasions the programme has disappeared off the air without warning. Here's listener Jeremy Brown.
I'd like to find out what's happened to Choral Evensong over the past few weeks. Initially, when I wrote, it was 3 breaks in transmission and now a 4th. For example, from Oxford, a most marvellous line-up prepared. You're listening to it and got well into the music, and it's most marvellous music. And suddenly there's a break in transmission. Well, these things happen, but 4 in a row, you start to lose confidence in listening to the programme. You're on edge, wondering when it's going to fail. Why can't one of the longest outside broadcasts of the BBC not be handled on a regular basis safely?
With me to reveal what went wrong is Christine Morgan, head of radio for BBC Religion. Thanks for coming on. Now, we've already heard one example from the 25th of April, but this did happen several times. Let me play you this clip from the 2nd of May. And I'll spare you and won't play any more, but there were 2 other instances. So, Christine Morgan, this seems to be unprecedented. Has anything like this ever happened before with Choral Evensong?
Well, actually, although it has been an extraordinary kind of sequence of events, I must admit, it isn't the first time that it has happened, because the listeners to Choral Evensong are so knowledgeable and they stay with us over so many years. We had them writing to us last week as, I must admit, a bit of a comfort, actually, to reassure us that this happened in 88 and again in the 90s, and one listener very helpfully said, and I think it was even more than 4. Obviously, we don't want to find ourselves with a series of events like this again, but I have to say these have been all totally unrelated.
That seems extraordinary. I mean, take the first 2 that we played, for example. What happened then?
Yes, well, the first was from Chichester when the satellite came off air for 8 minutes. And then on the 2nd of May from St John's College in Cambridge, that was a mains electrical failure, and that was in the locale. It actually took out the complete electrical infrastructure.
Well, if in that second case you were placed in an impossible position, in the first case the breakdown of the satellite link is something presumably within the BBC's control, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it has to be said that all the lines and the links, as they always have been, are provided by outside companies or organisations. I mean, they are not provided by the BBC, but obviously they're our responsibility.
Well, the BBC decides how much to commission and pay for. And one of our listeners, John Payne, who's a regional musical advisor at the Royal School of Church Music, emailed to say, this does smack of BBC cutbacks. I remember when we did live choral evensong during my days at Norwich Cathedral, the OB team always brought a standby generator with them. Do you use standby generators anymore?
Well, we don't actually. I mean, mostly because, the mains is a much more reliable and sustainable supply. And also, they can be noisy, they can be fumey. What we have in terms of our provision is a much better system now.
Well, much better in terms perhaps of the quality, but not in terms of breakdowns, because you seem to be suggesting that if things break down, there is no backup anymore.
No, well, of course, we'd have our battery backup to try and give the producer on site and our wonderful engineers the opportunity to get things re-established.
Well, the first breakdown, you said, was a break in the satellite connection. The second was a complete breakdown in power supply in the area and in the cathedral. There are two more programmes affecting. What went wrong in the broadcast transmission, Jay?
Well, actually, the first two were Chichester and St John's, and then 23rd of May was Wells Cathedral, and that was a line went down. It was just a break of transmission for a few minutes. The producer and engineer redialed immediately and re-established the line, and that can happen. It was
why does it happen? Is it that the BBC is using a new technology which is cheaper but more fallible?
No, really not. This provision is the provision that we've used and established and used over a long period of time, many years. It was just really unfortunate. And in terms of, for instance, the new college Oxford programme, there was, we think, it might have been a deluge of water that created a small earth leakage, and that would have tripped a 32 amp breaker.
But does this mean that in future you can't guarantee this won't happen again? The system in place is fallible, and therefore it is possible in future that choral evensongs will be interrupted and you can't do anything about it.
No, I'm not saying that at all. And I take some comfort from the fact that it was back in the 90s, since we had such a run of unfortunate events, one after another. I mean, I just must say, Roger, that the measure of dismay by some of the listeners is only matched by the dismay by my own team and the engineers, all of whom are as committed and love working on Choral Evensong and want to be able to bring an uninterrupted programme to the listeners.
Our thanks to Christine Morgan, whom I'm sure will also be praying before each subsequent broadcast of Choral Evensong. Now, remember when Radio 4 devoted over 8 hours to Stephen Fry reading the latest Harry Potter? Some sniffily suggested that J.K. Rowling was not worthy of such an honour, but few people deny the claim of James Joyce to be one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, even if relatively few of us read his masterpiece, Ulysses. Well, we no longer have to, as this year Radio 4 decided to make a Bloomfest of Bloomsday, which, as I'm sure you know, is the day when Leopold Bloom, hero of James Joyce's epic novel, makes his way through Dublin, while his wife Molly gets rather excited in bed. Radio 4 commissioned, amongst other special programmes, a 5.5-hour dramatisation of Ulysses, running from morning to midnight on the day itself.
A merchant is one who buys cheap and sells dear, Jew or Gentile, is he not?
They sinned against the light, and you can see the darkness in their eyes.
Who has not?
What do you mean?
Sinned. I mean,
history.
History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake.
All history moves towards one great goal, the manifestation of God.
That is God.
What?
A shout in the street.
Oh, dear me.
Some of you are delighted by the Bloomsday initiative and say you want to download the whole thing to keep forever. But listener Deirdre Lay points out that while the book's stature is undeniable, even BBC Radio 4's commissioning editor of drama Jeremy Howe admits in his blog that Ulysses does have the reputation of being the century's least read literary great.
My name is Deirdre Lay. I decided that I had to bite the bullet and read the book. I cannot pretend that I enjoyed it. I've loved the BBC's days, weeks and months on Dickens, Shakespeare and Mozart, but how many listeners are passionate about Joyce? If it is so little read, then I wish to contend the idea that this is one of the best books written in the last century. Is 5.5 hours of this overkill?
We'll be speaking to Jeremy Howe next week, so do let us know your reaction to his coverage of Bloomsday. Now here, with the details of how to get in touch, is the goddess of Radio 4 continuity, who can soothe my soul like no other. Take it away, Corrie Caulfield.
You can write to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London, SE1P 4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website.
Ah, those familiar, assured tones. The announcers are so calm and unflappable. Well, almost always. Do you remember when Charlotte Green was reading the news and got a fit of the giggles after hearing the oldest known recording of the human voice? And it wasn't me. It was a French woman singing Clair de Lune. But someone whispered in Charlotte's ear that the recording sounded like a swarm of bees. And that set her off.
The award-winning screenwriter Abbie Mann has died at the age of 80. He won an Academy Award in 1961 for Judgment at Nuremberg. Abbie Mann also won several Emmys, including one in 1973 for a film which featured a...
It works every time. The almost always unflappable Charlotte Green. And here's a question for Charlotte and her golden-throated colleagues.
I'm Oliver Keeley from North East Derbyshire, and I was wondering just how much honey Corrie and the others have to gargle to keep their voices sounding so lovely.
David Mars could have done with a bit of something soothing when reading the shipping forecast recently, although Feedback listener Jan was full of admiration for his efforts.
Tyree Automatic, north by east 2, 24 miles, 992, rising...
He had a very bad cough, but he made his way through the whole forecast without making barely a mistake.
Excuse me. So
I just thought someone like that, they just never get noticed or anything, and I really wanted to say somebody ought to thank him.
Felix Cornish is also happy to know that these captains of the airwaves are human. Almost.
I really like it when at the end of a programme they make a little comment which shows that they were listening as well and that they enjoyed the programme too. I'd also like to know a few things about these unsung heroes. Who are they? Why do they do it? And most importantly, what on earth do they do between their announcements?
Felix is just one of many of you who regularly contact us with questions about continuity, or CON as it's known. Most recently, Pete Swift asked for information about the technical side of presentation, and Lepreci tweeted to ask what happens when things go wrong. So we wangled an invitation to the presentation department to see if we could get you some answers.
For tomorrow, looking ahead.
Radio 4 commissions 13,500 programmes a year, and the announcers have to negotiate around 40 junctions a day. Operations Assistant Caroline Adams is on duty in presentation, making sure all those programmes and everything else is in place.
We have news on the hour every hour, we have weather forecasts, we have our trails, so it is all quite tightly timed. The actual, if you like, the sort of nitty-gritty of the day only gets dealt with probably a couple of days in advance, but there are people working on the Radio 4 schedule months, even up to a year or so in advance. And then it's my job to go through with a fine-tooth comb and check we have got all the programmes in and in the right place. This one, for example, is later tonight, 20:02 decision time.
And how do you know it's the right one?
I'll just click on the beginning.
It's decision time on war in the Middle East. A war...
I'll match that against the presentation details that I've got, and I've seen that it begins in the same way, so that's fine. And then I'll just spool through to the end and just play the last 5 seconds.
So from the engine room to the bridge, where Captain Corrie Caulfield is today's announcer, providing the links between programmes and news, using a combination of pre-recorded trails, prepared scripts and ad-libs where necessary. Live studio, quiet and do not enter, but... well, we are entering. Corrie, can we come in?
Yes.
Right. It looks as though you're a pilot on a 747 with a load of switches. Extraordinary. Yeah, you've got about 8 screens in front of you, and heaven knows how many switches. It's 3:35. What's the next thing you're going to do, or that the audience will hear?
The next thing that they will hear is what we call the junction before 4 o'clock, which will be the back announcement to this programme, which is All in the Mind. And the next fixed point in this hour will be the Greenwich Time signal at 50 9:55.
When it's a live show, do you have to listen particularly hard? Because if a line goes down, then you have to get in there very, very quickly.
It's pretty obvious. I mean, within about a second, you know when something's gone wrong. Silence is quite an extraordinary effect on us. If you're out for the evening and suddenly, the music stops in the pub or something, if you're a group of announcers around a table, they will all instantly look at the jukebox or wherever it is and see what's gone wrong. What we have in place now is a breakdown package, which I always have loaded into the system here, so it's ready to go. I mean, I'll play you a slight little bit of it here.
Is very much that there is a...
We're climbing gradually uphill down to my left. We can see...
So that's Claire recorded on a timeless package for rambling. So that would come in, and we know that's about 40 seconds. So if I've managed to re-establish the line to the studio manager in the studio, wherever it is, or control room, I know I've got 40 seconds that I could pot out of that and then go back and say, now we can rejoin our programme.
But if I prolong this catastrophe, let's say after 3 minutes you can't get the programme back.
After 3 minutes I have to be carried out of here on a stretcher, Roger.
When Corrie Caulfield first joined Radio 4 in 1988, the days of dinner suited continuity announcers with their precise received pronunciation were long gone.
The German wireless announced tonight the German government's reply to a British communication.
I asked Corrie how much her voice had changed since she first joined Radio 4.
I think I was much higher in voice, and I think I was actually a lot less relaxed, a lot more precise in my language on air. I think all of us were. I think we sounded quite clipped and very, very BBC.
The German announcer who read out these proposals...
Mark David Jacobs in Edinburgh. Recently, in the very early morning, I found myself still awake and with little chance of sleep in sight. In the moments before the mighty drum roll, I heard this from Arlene Fleming.
Well, I must go now, as my duties aren't quite over yet. There's Mr. Donaldson's smoking jacket to air and press, and Miss Green's feather boa to hang up. Newsreaders are high maintenance. Indeed, the life of a continuity announcer is not all it seems. Must go. They're calling for their cocoa. This is Arlene Fleming, wishing you a safe and peaceful night. Good night. One day they'll let me read the news.
Now, how can I thank Ms. Fleming enough for providing such a perfect and human note for the end of my day, and surely meant precisely for those such as myself who can sometimes find themselves in need of just one sympathetic and friendly voice in a long, dark night.
Continuity announcers also get to show their almost human side when they become part of the cast of the news quiz.
Jonathan Clark, who decides who gets to read the cuttings on the news quiz? Do they fight for it?
No, we wrote it. We're all given it's part of the shift that those of us that do it. I think if there's 8 in a run, they try and everybody has at least one chance, and sometimes you might be lucky enough to get 2.
Because you have the personality issue, because, on the one hand...
I'm keeping one eye on the clock here, I hope you'll realise.
But let me ask you about personality, because how much personality do you try to give to what you're doing, and are you aware that you mustn't go too far?
Yes, I think we are. I personally, and it is a very personal thing, I don't like a great personality in con. You are not bigger than the programmes. I think you're the guide to the network. I think you're a very reassuring voice that's there. Little glimpses are great. I think to do it all the time is tiresome. But that's a very personal view. Excuse me, I'm being called up to do a test for thinking aloud, I think. I think this is 78. Is that 78? Marvellous. Do you want to do the test? I have feedback with me here. But I'm going to explain now that this is the studio that is actually 3 floors above us, I suppose, at 70A. And the studio manager is going to send me some tone to line up. So I'm going to press pre-fade, and there it is. You can hear it.
It's a very boring tone, but effective.
It's very boring tone, and I'm looking at it. It's slightly high, so I'm just going to take it down just a little bit. There. Yeah, that's perfect. Lovely.
Well, we're now going to retreat to the corner and just listen to the 4 o'clock links through. How difficult is this going to be, Corrie?
This is the rub your tummy, pat your head at the same time. I've got about 4 things I'm going to fit in about a minute and 20.
And what are they?
Well, one is going to be, I'm going to back announce this programme and credit them. Then I'm going to point to what is coming up after the news bulletin. Then I'm going to play a trail. And then I'm going to hopefully have the Greenwich time signal. And then I'm going to go to the news. That's 5.
Good luck.
Okay, thank
you.
Next week, it's 12 years since the scandal where some members of the Spanish Paralympic basketball team had to hand back their gold medals after...
All in the Mind was presented by Claudia Hammond. The producer was Fiona Hill. And you can download this
My thanks to Corrie Caulfield, Caroline Adams, and all in the presentation department of Radio 4. and now an unwanted departure. Many of you listening to this network at 11 o'clock last Saturday morning were shocked to hear the presenter, Marianne Sieghart, conclude a very amusing programme on political humour with this.
Well, that's it for this week, and I'm afraid for Beyond Westminster. This was our last ever programme. Hope you enjoyed it.
My name's Liz Copeman, and I was so disappointed to hear at the end of Beyond Westminster on Saturday that it wasn't going to be continued anymore, because it's consistently intelligent and stimulating, with commentators who feel able to say what they really think, rather than just rehearsing the party line, word for word sometimes.
It is, I think, both a huge advantage to him in getting him to where he's got, and perhaps a glass ceiling on his getting any further, because he is always a little bit playing the fool, and people love that.
My name's Steve Ingle. It always struck me that programme, Beyond Westminster, had its own particular style. You got a sort of informal view of what had been going on, got a variety of points of view from politicians themselves and from commentators, and they seemed to be rather more unbuttoned than they usually are on more newsy type programmes. And I would like something to replace it in very much the same style, please.
And we were sitting in the production office and the Parliament was live on the telly, and I'm sitting there with Angus Deaton and the producers, and these jokes start coming out that Angus recognised as the ones he'd turned down half an hour earlier, and he's going, you wrote those for me. I said, well, you didn't want them, so I gave them to the Chancellor.
My name is Brian Mayers. I'm something of a newsaholic, very interested in politics. So I was dismayed, astounded to hear that that will be the last in the series of Beyond Westminster. To me, it satisfied all the original established aims of the BBC to be educational, informative and entertaining.
Dearly beloved and sagacious leader. Why not's what John Prescott calls me. Sometimes.
Well, my name's Hugh Sharman, and I'm shocked by the announcement last week that excellent programme, which had me laughing, and which was so intelligently and well presented, is going to be the last of the series. It can't be an expensive programme to put together. The politicians come for nothing, and they probably pay you. And I do want to know what they're going to replace it with. I hope no more touchy-feely, silly programs that elderly energy consultants like me don't want to listen to.
It's a program that looks at politics in depth. And it's so frustrating when a program you think is great just gets axed without any apparent reason. So please reconsider.
We put your points to Radio 4, and this is what they said.
The decision to decommission this programme was announced in October as part of the BBC's budget cuts following the licence fee freeze. While we appreciate listeners are disappointed, output on Radio 4 has been largely protected. The station remains committed to current affairs, including political programming, and we would like to tell listeners that they will now have the opportunity to hear the Ideas discussion show The Forum, presented by Bridget Kendall and currently broadcast on the World Service in place of Beyond Westminster.
Well, I'll miss it as well. Next week, we'll be talking to the relatively new controller of Radio 1, Ben Cooper. It's an interesting time for Radio 1, which is in the process of shaking up its schedule under pressure from the BBC Trust to bring down the average age of its audience, and under pressure from the public at large to reveal how long Chris Moyles will present The Breakfast Show. It will be Mr. Cooper's first time on Feedback in his new role, so do help me welcome him by providing me with lots of penetrating questions about his station. And that's all for Feedback this week. Well, almost all. We couldn't possibly go without revealing the identity of that august commentator who described the Queen's coronation for the BBC and was last week mistaken for Richard Dimbleby. You have been busy guessing his real identity.
The Dean of Westminster takes the orb, and the Archbishop places in the Queen's right hand...
Hello, my name is Angela Buckley, and I listened with interest where you played the spurious Richard Dimbleby clip, but I was slightly miffed to say that you didn't actually say who it was.
Jim Taylor, speaking from Stockport. My guess would be Godfrey Talbot, the royal correspondent at the time. Am I right?
I've discovered a chap called Howard Marshall, who was actually known for cricket commentating, But he was in the Abbey on the day of the coronation in 1953. That's my best guess anyway, Howard Marshall.
Roger, please put us out of our misery and tell us, who was it?
Well, I'm joined now by somebody who claims to know the answer, a voice you may well recognise, Norman Cuddiford, who was a freelance broadcaster for the BBC for 34 years, covered all sorts of sports. So, Norman, who do you think it is?
Well, I think without a doubt, Roger, it was the great John Snagg, who I actually had the privilege of working with for a whole week up in Nottingham in 1976 during the World Rowing Championships.
John Snagg sounded typically upper-class, rather uptight, English gentleman with no sense of humour. Was that him in private life?
Not at all. He, when we worked for a week together, he was very kind and took my darling wife and I out for dinner one night and regaled us with the most marvellous stories, marvellous stories. He was at the top of the Victoria Memorial, and his brief was to describe the departure of their Majesties from the palace down the Mall to Westminster Abbey, and 2 hours later pick up the commentary again as they came back down the Mall into the forecourt of the palace, and 5 minutes later they would be appearing on the balcony. But no such luck. 5 minutes became 10 minutes, 10 minutes became 20 minutes, and 20 minutes became 40 minutes before they eventually came on the balcony. Well, he was getting rather short of material by that stage. But as chance would have it, a few weeks later he went into a pub in Windsor, and standing at the bar was the King's personal private secretary. And John Snagg said to him, "Tell me, what was the problem over the delay in their Majesties getting up to the balcony on the day of the coronation?" So the King's PPS said, "Oh, it's very simple. When their Majesties got back to the palace, the first thing the King said to me was, 'Tell me, how is the wireless broadcast going?' And I said, 'Well, sir, it's still on.' And he said, 'Well, let's sit down and have a cup of tea and listen to it.'"
And the poor man, doubtless the sweat was pouring off, but I bet you couldn't have heard it in his voice.
Absolutely.
Norman Cuddiford, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
My thanks to Norman Cuddiford, and of course to the late great John Snagg, who despite his sonorous voice and old-school image, retained a healthy sense of self-parody, witnessed by his occasional appearances on The Goon Show, and most startling of all, a contribution to a Sex Pistols B-side. Goodbye.
Sex Pistols. They stuck a safety pin through Her Majesty's nose and turned the national press into an occupied zone.
Really? And the case of the mysterious voice. In last week's programme, we played you a clip of a commentator describing the Queen's coronation. The World at One said it was Richard Dimbleby. But they were mistaken. So, who is this?
The Dean of Westminster takes the orb, and the Archbishop places in the Queen's right hand the sceptre with the cross, the ensign of kingly power.
All will be revealed later, but I'll give you some clues. He wore a moustache. His middle names were Derek Mordaunt. And he was 22 when, in 1926, the BBC first broadcast Choral Evensong. 86 years later, and now on Radio 3, that programme can claim to be the longest-running outside broadcast anywhere in the world. Choral Evensong travels the kingdom from Truro to Edinburgh, and listener Susan Lester never misses an edition.
I love the programme. I have done for years and years and years. Unfortunately, I do tend to sing along to the hymns. Heaven knows what my neighbours think.
On a basis, safely.
With me to reveal what went wrong is Christine Morgan, head of radio for BBC Religion. Thanks for coming on. Now, we've already heard one example from the 25th of April, but this did happen several times. Let me play you this clip from the 2nd of May. And I'll spare you and won't play any more, but there were two other instances. So, Christine Morgan, this seems to be unprecedented. Has anything like this ever happened before with Choral Evensong?
Well, actually, although it has been an extraordinary kind of sequence of events, I must admit, it isn't the first time that it has happened, because the listeners to Choral Evensong are so knowledgeable and they stay with us over so many years. We had them writing to us last week as, I must admit, a bit of a comfort, actually, to reassure us that this happened in 88 and again in the 90s, and one listener very helpfully said, and I think it was even more than 4. Obviously, we don't want to find ourselves with a series of events like this again, but I have to say these have been all totally unrelated.
That seems extraordinary. I mean, take the first two that we played, for example. What happened then?
Yes, well, the first was from Chichester when the satellite came off air for 8 minutes. And then on the 2nd of May from St John's College in Cambridge. That was a mains electrical failure, and that was in the locale. It actually took out the complete electrical infrastructure.
Well, if in that second case you were placed in an impossible position, in the first case the breakdown of the satellite link is something presumably within the BBC's control, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it has to be said that all the lines and the links, as they always have been, are provided by outside companies or organisations. I mean, they are not provided by the BBC, but obviously they're our responsibility.
Well, the BBC decided this is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. To misquote Oscar Wilde's Lady Bracknell, to lose one Choral Evensong may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. In fact, Radio 3 lost 4 in 5 weeks.
For the love of thy only Son, our Saviour, Jesus Christ.
Whoops, that was the first of many. In feedback this week, provided we don't drop off the air, we'll try and find out what keeps going wrong. Is it divine displeasure? And it's a hard life in Radio 4's presentation department.
Well, I must go now, as my duties aren't quite over yet. There's Mr. Donaldson's smoking jacket to air and press, and Miss Green's feather boa to hang up. Newsreaders are high maintenance. Indeed, the life of a continuity announcer is not all it seems.
And I do find it, a bit of a haven. The world is so mad at the moment. Everybody rushes around. But for an hour, sometimes twice a week, you can just think about the important things in life.
Susan is not the only one who sings along with the hymns, but recently she has found herself frequently unaccompanied, as on several occasions the programme has disappeared off the air without warning. Here's listener Jeremy Brown.
I'd like to find out what's happened to Choral Evensong over the past few weeks. Initially when I wrote it was 3 breaks in transmission and now a 4th. For example, from Oxford, a most marvellous line-up prepared. You're listening to it and got well into the music, and it's most marvellous music. And suddenly there's a break in transmission. Well, these things happen, but 4 in a row, you start to lose confidence in listening to the programme. You're on edge, wondering when it's going to fail. Why can't one of the longest outside broadcasts of the BBC not be handled on a regular